Okay, bye.
All right. Okay. Judges ready? Partner ready? Sorry. All right. Opponents ready. Sounds good. Just quick introduction for formality's sake and the recording, I guess. My name is Kyler Parker. I'm going to be the Prime Minister for the government, affirming this House believes that, in hindsight, the United States federal government should not have shut down the economy. In that case, I'll get started on my first word. At the point at which shutting down the United States economy led to so many losses of jobs, losses of mental health, and an overall decrease in the net utility of the planet, I am so proud to propose. First, some definitions. This House is a rational individual. Framework or main mechanism is net benefits to the world. Shutdown, restrictions on businesses remaining open and able to provide services to the public. Economy, wealth and resources of a country or region, especially in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services. So economy as it's commonly understood. In hindsight, considering all the net harms and benefits that resulted from the shutdown, and just some quick points of framing here. So, the economic shutdown, we'd say was not very effective because despite businesses being closed, the United States still had one of the highest rates of COVID in the world. And this is just because people were still able to skirt around these requirements even, but there were other ways that COVID spread, and COVID was being such an infective disease itself was not really hampered because people still had to go out, right? People had to go get groceries, people had to go to public places. So because of this, the impact of the economic shutdown on how well US responded to COVID was marginal. So therefore, we'd say that economic shutdown overall was not that effective. If the economy was open, this is like a sub point too, social restrictions could still be in place if the United States had not shut down the economy. They could still say, don't gather in public places, don't have more than 5 people, mask up, stay 6 feet apart. All of these things could still have been in place as long as they were allowing the economy to be open too. With that being said, I have 3 contentions for you. Contention number 1 is about the suffering of the economy. Contention 2 is about the negative impact of the economic shutdown for US citizens. And the third contention is about negative impacts of the shutdown for the rest of the world. With that being said, our point 1 is that the economy suffered substantially due to its shutdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. So number 1, because the economy shut down, smaller businesses struggled and many floundered. They were not able to survive the loss of business, the loss of revenue, and they weren't able to make ends meet and had to go bankrupt. And basically, many companies like Walmart could just replace them or they were bought out. And essentially, all of these companies either stopped existing or fell under the umbrella of a larger company, leading to more corporate consolidation. Basically, more companies were consolidated under larger umbrellas during COVID-19 pandemic or died out altogether. Therefore, after coming out of the pandemic, companies like Amazon had more power. Companies like Walmart had more power. All of these large companies, Amazon especially, had more power because of the fact that people couldn't really go, people were more afraid to go to stores, so they had packages delivered to their house. So just worsened the consolidation that happened during the shutdown. So secondly, there was a drop in GDP due to the pandemic, right? There was less economic growth as businesses were closed, less manufacturing. This led to fewer people being lifted out of poverty, and many people actually fell back into poverty due to the shutdown. We also saw a loss of American competitiveness globally because of the hampering of our economy, and we saw China and Russia kind of catching up to us because of how much we were losing in terms of our economic power. China and Russia seeing American as weakening is a very bad thing because it led them to feel more safe in their hostile actions, such as aggression towards Taiwan, such as the Russia-Ukrainian war. We say that there would be lower probability of the Russian-Ukrainian war if the Americans had not appeared economically weak and just weak in general. So what are the impacts of all of this? Well, impact of point 1 consolidation. The consolidation of lots of companies under these umbrellas of large corporations is very bad because it leads to less competition and it leads to these monopolistic companies. Leads us to start slipping into monopoly where these companies can set the prices they want, treat their workers badly, only paying them slightly above or minimum wage, and just generally worsening American economy because we don't want to live in a monopolistic and oligopolistic world. We also saw that the poor families slipped further into poverty. All Americans suffered from higher prices due to consolidation of businesses. This is just a net disutility. Workers suffered because they did not have jobs. They were unemployed. American foreign influence suffered, and people died in Ukraine as a result of this because they were not feared enough by the Russians and the Chinese. All right. Intention number 2 is the negative impacts of the economic shutdown for US citizens. Point 1 here is like mental health. So basically, having a job meant you could like go to work every day and see other people. But because of the economic shutdowns brought about by the pandemic, many workers like lost their jobs or had to stay at homes, like work virtually. So what did this lead to? This lead to a loss of social life, because the fact is you have a lot of friends at work. So US workers were like not seeing their friends at all because they got fired, or seeing less of their friends. And this is just lead to a decrease in happiness, because seeing your friends more is just better. Okay. Additionally, being indoors all the time for those who like had no job or had to work from home was very bad, because people need like sunlight, people need fresh air, and just being in like a claustrophobic home is terrible for the mental health. It gets you like closed in and makes you feel like you are hopeless. Etc. There was a lot of anxiety during the pandemic, because you really felt like there was a danger in COVID, and the government worsened this by shutting down the economy. Like shutting down the economy was really extreme. By shutting down the economy in response to COVID, they were playing into the idea that it was a very terrifying thing, something to be very afraid of, and thus the added anxiety of this made people feel like hopeless, made people feel like their lives were in danger, worsening their mental health. If I think something could kill me and it's outside all around me, I'm just going to be very anxious, and this is exactly what happened in the United States. So basically, if the US workers could have gone to work, so much of this would be fixed, and there would be a greater sense of fulfillment from being able to see their friends and just from being able to work. Next point here is finances. Obviously, there was a huge unemployment, so we would see more employment with the economy not closed. Another point here is polarization. So basically, because people were cooped up inside so much, we say that they turned a lot to extremism, like many people on the far right, because they didn't trust like the mainstream media to report anymore because of the extreme nature of the situation. For example, they turned to InfoWars and they turned to Fox News because they didn't agree with the actions the government was taking, like taking away their livelihood. So they felt like they needed to turn somewhere else that did not support the government. And this led to people becoming anti-vaxxers and more extreme views, leading to more deaths. And eventually, we think contributed to January 6th, because people were like following the conspiracy theories because they didn't like the actions of the government. All of this just led to an overall loss of trust in the government, because the measures were ineffective, because there were still huge harms. And there was just a huge mistrust of the coastal elites who were perceived as running the government. Because of this, people are less willing to listen to the government in a future crisis because of this president, and more future deaths will happen because people will be more reluctant to accept shutdown restrictions. Impacts: loneliness epidemic worsened, polarization, deaths, more anti-vax deaths, so many more deaths in the future, net disutility. My third and final contention is about the negative impacts of the shutdown for the rest of the globe. So the US economy is an integral part of the world economy. Like obviously, US economy is a key part of world supply chains, world financial entanglements, etc. The COVID shutdown meant there was a decrease in manufacturing of needed goods in America, a decrease in all like commerce happening in America that the rest of the world relied on, especially manufacturing of like high-tech components needed for many anti-climate change technologies. So because of this, we think there was a net decrease in the efficacy of the world in fighting climate change, because these components were not manufactured. But also there was just a net decrease in the utility of the world because they were not getting the things they needed. People were not getting the resources they needed, and that was severely impactful. Second point here is signaling effect. US shutdown signaled that shutdown was the right choice. So many smaller countries also shut down, and this might not have been the right choice for them, as people in those countries needed to eat from their jobs. So they were severely impacted and starved. Marginal climate harms, so proud to propose.
Amazing. Okay. Hi, I'm Jenny. I'll be the first speaker for op, and I'm just gonna go over top of case, observations, and then I'll go into op case, and then I'll go into gov case. Okay. I'll begin my time now. So I want to go over like some overarching questions and observations about the round. So I think how Gov kind of tries to frame this, like a lot of their contentions are about like why the pandemic was bad. And we completely agree with that. But I don't think that this round is about like whether the pandemic was or wasn't bad. It's about like what the best possible response could have been on the part of the US federal government. So I think there are a few things that we have to talk about here. And the first one is the idea about like what is like the principled like correct thing to do. So a big thing that we like have to talk about here is like who did COVID affect? So COVID most affected immunocompromised people, elderly people, people who were already sick. And so oftentimes this wasn't people who were like going into work, but oftentimes those people would be at risk if like they were living in like a household where someone did go out to work and then they brought COVID back. So I think that's a big part of it. Like this isn't just about like on the individual level, like if an individual gets sick, it impacts a bunch of other people, and those second and third order consequences of like one person getting COVID can like cause a bunch of other people to die. And I think that's a super important thing to like think about when you're framing this round. Okay, so now I'm gonna go into my contentions. Basically, I'm gonna prove to you about why this was the best course of action for the US federal government to do and why anything else would have led to a net harm or death. So first contention is about health and safety. So, some point, the economic shutdown led to people not going out to work, so it stopped the spread. Like without a forced shutdown, people probably would have chosen to keep working, which would have led to more cases. So, who does this uniquely impact? It uniquely impacts lower income people because they typically do jobs that can't be done remotely, and they would have been pressured into going to work at risk of like losing their jobs. Then they probably would have gotten sick, brought it back to their family, spread it to a bunch of other people. Now, my opponents talk about how like people still went outside, and we think this is true, but people went outside for like much shorter like periods of time. Like if you go out to get groceries, that's like an hour at most, and like you're in the car for a lot of it, and like you can be masked. If you're working like 9 to 5 every day, like you're like around people a lot more and you're at a lot higher risk of getting COVID. So we think that like just like the exposure time being lowered by making people stay at home, not right now, is going to be a huge benefit. Then the idea again, like about like spreading COVID back to like vulnerable people in the household. I think a really important part to talk about is like if you are like the person who is responsible for like your family's income, and so like you are working and you're working like a menial labor job, and the economy wasn't shut down, then you're going to go out, you're going to come back to like maybe like you're living with an immunocompromised person, you're putting them at risk. So I think the important thing here is like this isn't again like an individual decision like that each like singular citizen can make. It has to impact a bunch of other people in America, and that means that the government kind of has to step in because they're talking about like the general welfare of American citizens as a whole, not about individual people. Individual people can make their own choices, but when it's at the expense of other people's lives, we think that that's when the government needs to step in. Second contention is about harms to the healthcare system. So we kind of proved about like how like having the government shut down did lead to like fewer COVID cases. Like, yes, there were a bunch of COVID cases, but like due to the fact that like people were just like out for shorter periods of time meant that like there were like fewer cases. We think this is pretty intuitive. Like even if there were still a lot, it would have been way worse if the government hadn't shut down. So what does this mean for the healthcare system? So hospitals were already overwhelmed like with the economy being shut down by the number of people needing care. Like they were unable to give good care to basically everyone because there were so many sick people. So if even more people were sick, which you can buy because of my warranty and my C1, then the care would have been even worse for each individual person because the number of doctors and nurses and hospital beds and ventilators don't go up, but the number of patients do. So what do we get? We get more loss of life. We get burnout for healthcare professionals, and uniquely, we get anyone who like had like another problem like medically that wasn't COVID wasn't going to get care. So like if you needed maternity care, if you like had like an accident, if you fell down, like the hospitals were already so overrun that like they would not be able to take care of you, and that problem would just be amplified if you have more patients needing care, which you prove is going to happen if you didn't shut down the economy. Then finally, third contention, the importance of listening to scientists. So the people pushing for a shutdown were scientists who like best understood the virus and how easily it spread. And so the choice of politicians to listen to facts is a tenet of democracy. Why is this true? Because politicians listening to facts, following advice according to reality, demonstrates that in order to act, you need appropriate, accurate information. So this point is demonstrated by the fact that for the most part, like the shutdown didn't need enforcement apart from like this vocal minority who like really wanted to go out. But like most people like were willing to listen to the science and follow their instructions. Like as an example, in New York, like the subway was like open, but like barely anybody took it in the height of the pandemic, even though like they technically could, because they were choosing not to, because they were listening to the science and because they weren't going out because like they weren't going to work. So what does that mean? It means that when politicians make that choice to listen to science, it encourages the citizens to do the same thing. Why is this important? It's applicable to other political problems or like things that become politicized, like climate change and vaccinations. And it amplifies the importance of trusting experts and researchers in fields. This is a clear demonstration of that. So on the principle of just like listening to scientists, research, and facts, it's really important to do that. And this was demonstrated by shutting down the economy. If this hadn't been done, then we could have seen a lot of like harms to like people not listening to scientists as much, would have led to like disrespect of like facts and led to just like a less educated society, which we think would be a net negative. Now going into side government case. So basically what they talk about is their first top of case thing is about how like the economic shutdown wasn't very effective. And again, I think like we can see that like it wasn't perfect, but intuitively like it was better, right? Like it's not going to be great. Like we're not looking for perfection here. Like COVID was horrible and like nothing's going to change that. But like we think that like you can't really ignore the fact that, like because of the economic shutdown, like fewer people went out and therefore fewer people got COVID. So you have fewer people getting sick. on op world. Now onto their first point about the suffering of economy. So we'd say like all of these impacts that they're trying to like blow out of proportion can be partly mitigated because of a lot of government programs. So like there was a paycheck protection program that like gave loans to like small businesses and like helped people, like people got stimulus checks. Like I think like the idea that like everything was just like left helpless and like cut loose by the government is not necessarily true. Did it like completely fix everything? Did it save every business? No, but it helped. Like I don't think that it's true that, like every single business just like completely went under. We think the government like was still partially involved. So we think that the idea that like the corporate consolidation like happened entirely is not necessarily true. We think we can mitigate these impacts by the fact that the government had like a lot of interaction with like small businesses. Like they gave a lot of loans, they gave a lot of it was like the CARES Act, I think. Like they did a lot of things to help small businesses. So we think we can mitigate this. And then furthermore, on the idea of like people falling into poverty, they talk a lot about like this idea, and we think this is true, but we think like on the flip side, again, if you're a low-income person and the economy's not shut down, then you're like Amazon's going to tell you come into work or else you're going to get fired. So either you don't go into work and you don't get any money, or you go into work and then you get sick and you probably like don't have like a great like sick leave policy, or you don't have a great health insurance. So then you're going to be stuck having COVID. You might give it to other people. You're going to be in a way worse position. So we don't really see like any benefits for these low income people if they did end up like going to work, because they probably would have just gotten sick and then been harmed and then not gotten anything out of it. So we don't really see any like net benefits for these people if like we had like kept the economy open. We see that like basically the same thing would have happened, and like potentially even worse, because they would have been more likely to get sick. We think that at least on-site opposition, if they're forced to stay home, they get like stimulus checks. Maybe it's not enough, maybe it's not great, but it's something, and it means that they don't have to risk their lives and risk their families' lives and risk everyone that they live with's lives to go out and make like a very small piece of money. Then on their idea of like American foreign influence suffering, we say like this just like isn't as important as like these as the idea of like the American citizens, because we're talking about America. But furthermore, I kind of want to question the idea of this, like why like it's true that like Russia and China like kind of like were empowered to like do these things because of like America's loss of like economy. I think it's also just because like Russia and China got more powerful in this period. Like I think it wasn't necessarily to do with like America specifically, more like independently Russia and China had like enough resources to do these things. I think it's less like to do with America. So I think this point isn't like unique to this. It probably would have happened in either world. Then I'll get into more refutations later on. But finally, just to go over like the idea of negative impacts for US citizens on terminability, like you can get treatment for depression. You can't get treatment if you're dead from COVID. So we think that like there's a clear like comparison here. Neither are good, but one is like at least solvable, like to some extent, like something that has the possibility of being fixed. The other one has no hope for change or for solvency whatsoever. For all of those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Okay, so I'm Levy. I will be the member of government, and in this speech, I'll just go over some top of case stuff, after which I will go through the opposition case and then return to the government case. So starting my time now. Okay, so just like top of case stuff, we talk about like how like on side government, we restore the power of choice to like every American, whilst opposite like op is like forcing people to, you know, stay home and not work, right? There's no opportunity for people to like weigh the risks on their own, right? We think that most rational people are able to consider, you know, if they had you know, people they needed to protect, that they could probably try to find an alternative job, or, you know, I'd imagine there's a reasonable counterfactual that the government would have still provided like benefits to people who could not work because they live with immunocompromised people, right? And so we also tell you that like the majority of workers were not immunocompromised, right? The majority that had this or had family members, right? They could have chose, or they could have found a job. So it's really non-unique. And, you know, under the opposition side, everybody's forced to lose their jobs. You know, on our side, only a few people, you know, may need to decide they should change their jobs. So it's, you know, uniquely worse that so many people lost their jobs compared to people who, you know, could have had the choice, right? So we should still win on this, right? And let's talk about like real quick. I'm gonna put this under top of case. So they talk about like in a lot of places how like lower income people will suffer more from COVID, and how they would not have a choice, they would need to go to work. Well, I will tell you that under the shutdown, these people were still forced to go to work, right? Why is this? Because they were working, you know, essential jobs. They were essential workers, because these people were doing the things, you know, often for low pay that, you know, America depended upon to function. They were like garbage collections, you know, municipal workers, construction workers, etc. Right? These are traditionally low-paying jobs, and they're still people who be forced to go out and work in the name of like doing good for everybody. So these essential workers, still had to work. So really, Alp's point is non-unique about how low-income people, would be forced to go to work. So moving on more specifically to like their first contention, right? We know that the average person, gets COVID, they're sick for a week tops or a few days, and then most, if they don't have a underlying condition, they will be fine, right? That's so much better than losing your job for like months straight when you cannot work. You may get a small stimulus check. That's not necessarily going to be enough to like pay for like your family's food, right? And we're talking about a very small minority of people who could die, if they chose to not make the choice and take these risks for themselves, or after consultation with their family, as opposed to thousands of people losing their jobs and maybe not being able to work or like buy food, right? And furthermore, I'd like to respond again about like essential workers typically being these low-income people that OP characterizes as being forced to work under our side of the house. We tell that happens under both sides. It's not unique because once more we force the essential workers to do this, right? And so we talk about like harms to the healthcare system. We tell you that transmission actually didn't occur mostly at work. Is that a lot of jobs typically don't involve or are able to be done without like that much contact. Like think about like this: US is like a service-based economy, right? So typically that means that like people are either typing away alone on their laptops and don't need to like go face to face with people, or they're like essential workers typically who we forced to go out and work anyway. So really, once again, there isn't like a huge like correlation on like harms to the healthcare system, right? This is mostly just mitigated or just doesn't even happen. And then finally, on their contention about importance of listening to scientists, right? This is a complete turn onto our side, right? We show like in our contention that, which I'll get to furthermore in a second, that the COVID-19 response and how the government in many ways botched the communication with the economic shutdown and how the economic shutdown occurred, and its disproportionality led many people to seek like harmful like alternative sources of news, right? See InfoWars, see Fox News, see this kind of fake news that like became more prevalent, which saw like probably a huge spike in anti-vax positions. We saw fewer people actually trusting scientists. So once more this complete turn, it's actually pretty clear just government win, like in and of itself, this one turn, because we can see that in the future some crisis, some pandemic would happen again, then we'd be significantly worse off when it's actually more important, when we do think that these kind of shutdowns would actually be effective, because now people saw they lied to us during COVID, don't trust crooked Washington, right? And so we'll see that more people will actually die in the future. So it's a pretty clean like golf ballot just in and of itself on this turn. So moving on to our first contention on like how the economy, big pardon, suffered, right? So they only give us this like response to the government tried to do things like paycheck, like PPP loans and like stimulus checks, and how the government tried to mitigate these impacts. Well, like they just simply weren't enough, right? Like just take a gut check. Like, are you better to have like thousands of people like doing business in your store like over time, over a month, or is it better to get like a small couple $100 check or loan or whatever? Like it just makes a lot of sense that like you're worse off. And in addition, this also led to rampant inflation, which caused huge economic harms for the and still continues to cause huge economic harms to the average person, during the pandemic and post like pandemic, right? And they talk about like poverty in response to like our second subpoint about how poverty is less bad than getting sick with bad healthcare and then like spreading COVID. Well, we tell that people can get better from sickness. Like the immune system of the average person, the vast majority of people can get rid of COVID in like a week, right? Think about it this way. If you're like in poverty, it's so much harder. You're living paycheck to paycheck, all the money you earn just goes into like surviving and like buying food for the next week. So, also like American systems are hugely biased against people in poverty, right? See how like you have like richer people can avoid like lawsuits just because they can like outpay people, right? So first of all, we tell you that it's much better to have a job and get sick, right? And think about if you still get sick from going out to buy groceries or something, right? It's so much worse if you don't have a job, if you haven't been able to, if you've been living on these small government aid, and then you have no savings. Now you're still sick, but you don't even have a job. You don't have money. Think about how much worse you're off. Right? Complete turn on this for us, right? And then like talking about like the Russia and China point, so that they talk about how like Russia and China were getting more powerful on their own. Yeah, it's true. But think about this. It's not like they don't get more powerful on their own. It's also that they're getting relatively more powerful. So we think that, and even if America was not getting weaker, in their biased simple perception that America was getting weaker because their economy shut down, they had no growth, would have emboldened them. And they knew America wouldn't be able to respond so forcefully. And as a result, thousands, tens of thousands of deaths in Ukraine, Chinese imperialism in the South China Sea, so on and so forth, right? And then as to like the negative impacts for individual people, like our second contention, this just went dropped. And so like I just like to extend this to like jobs are an important source of connection, even if they're not like in person, like where you'd be spreading disease, you can still talk to people, you still collaborate with people on projects. And so this helps combat this kind of isolation so better mental health. This also prevents people from like being as susceptible to like extreme political views, which we saw. Like, remember, it's a clean ballot that people are much less likely to believe in science, like on on the opposition side. So it's a clean gov ballot right there. And so for these reasons, we urge a gov ballot.
Okay. Is anyone not ready? Okay, I'm just gonna go top of case, line by line, refutation on Gov's case, and then I'll go back into op case, and I'll stop in between my speeches. Okay, I'll start my time now. So the first thing that MG brings up is this idea of like restoring choice to every American and how like people like need to be able to weigh the risks on their own. So I have two responses here. The first one is something I bring up in my first speech, the idea that America has the obligation to step in when like your individual choice can like hurt someone else, right? So like again, like this isn't just about like one person, it's about like who you can give the disease to. Like it's like the same idea about like why like a lot of places like mandate like or like there are laws about like guns, right? Like you can't like have a gun in like house with like a kid because it doesn't just affect you, it also puts at risk everyone else that you're around. Like that's the important thing. It's not just affecting you, it's affecting other people. And that's when America does have that obligation. And then furthermore, they have this idea that people can like weigh the risks on their own. And the response here is that like if you're poor and you're struggling and you're living meal to meal, you're obviously gonna like risk your life to provide for your family. Like even if it's not the smart decision, you're gonna do that because you are desperate for that. Like, right? Like you don't have any other options because like you're like, if you're like working a low-income job, your company's probably not gonna like give you some leave because like you have an immunocompromised person at home, which means you don't really have a choice. Like people like who like are in poverty are not going to have a choice in this scenario. So the idea that like people are going to like weigh these risks, that's only really applicable to the people who have a financial cushion to fall back on, which is not most people. So this idea is not necessarily true. The final thing I want to talk about on this topic case is the idea of like what it means to get COVID in 2020. So like kind of tries to like minimize the effects of like what it means to like have COVID. And I want to remind people like we're talking about like not COVID like right now, but like COVID before there was a vaccine, before people knew like how to deal with it, how to treat it, like before we like, but when it was like a completely new virus that nobody knew anything about. Like this was not something that like people like got for a week and then recovered from. Like healthy people in 2020 were dying from COVID because doctors didn't know like how to deal with it, they didn't know how to treat it well. B, there were so many patients that like doctors were overwhelmed, so they couldn't give like adequate care to like every single person. And C, because there were no vaccinations, so people didn't really like, their immune systems weren't like prepared to deal with it. So I want to make sure that like everyone understands that like COVID was like way more serious at this time than it is right now. So like the threat of COVID is not just like a week-long cold, right? It's a very serious disease that killed so many people, like both immunocompromised and healthy. Now going into line by line refutation. So on their first contention about suffering of the economy, what MG tells you is that these stimulus checks were not enough. We agree, but again, like some is better than none. Like they don't have any like alternative solvency here, because they don't really respond to the idea that like if like people go to work, they're just gonna get sick. They're not gonna get like pay for like their sick days, because again, they're like working a low income job. Like the companies probably aren't going to provide that. They probably don't have great like policies for their workers. So you're not really going to get money in that world either. We don't really see how one is better. And then this idea about how like the stimulus checks led to inflation, we'd say like the counterfactual here about like if something happened like with like deflation, like that would have been way worse. The economy would have shrunk. So we think like the counterfactual here, you kind of have to take that like even if the stimulus checks weren't great, like inflation's better than deflation. Then finally, they say that people can get better from sick. Huh?
POI.
Sure.
Would there have been deflation if the economy had kept running?
I think probably yes, because we think that so many workers would have gotten sick, like companies wouldn't have been able to run adequately, and there would have just been like a bunch of chaos because like there would have been like demand, like there would have been like the ability to stay open, but like companies would have just kept like forcing their workers to come in, even if workers were sick, would have led to just like a decrease in the number of workers available and like harms to just like people's lives. Then finally, on their idea about how like America was like perceptually weaker, we think like you can just compare this to like if like millions of people die in America, like millions more people die in the gov world, that's also going to make America seem weaker. Like there's no like winner in this debate, right? Like both sides judges are pretty bad. We're just arguing about like which is least worst, right? Like COVID was horrible. We're just saying that like the shutdown was the best decision for the government to make. Now going on to their second contention, they talk about negative impacts for US citizens. And again, like on this idea of terminability, the only response that we get here from government is the idea like, oh, you can treat the sickness, right? Like, yes, this is true, but like again, in 2020, it was like really hard to treat COVID-19. And even when like people like didn't die from it, like oftentimes they had like these huge like health harms, like people struggled with breathing, like people like couldn't like taste, like there were a bunch of huge harms that like weren't really mitigated. So we think that like the idea that like you can like solve for COVID-19 like is like maybe true, but like the impacts are not very huge. And because you're going to get like millions more sick people, we think the doctors are going to be providing even worse care on-site government. Then on this idea about like lots of anxiety of the government worsening fear, we think this is not unique. We think there was like a lot of fear mongering regardless of the government shutdown, because like 2020 was like an election year, and so like everyone was kind of arguing like I'm going to be best for our country and like we're all like in danger, but like I'm the one who can save you. I think that like this wasn't really unique to one side. And then on the idea of like finances and like the huge unemployment, we'd say again like the fact that like workers like at least like weren't like kind of forced like to go into work, like there's not a fallacy of choice. We think that like on-site government, you get like this like false idea that like workers have agency in deciding whether they want to go to work, but in reality when you need the money, you're going to go into work regardless of like the dangers to your health. We think that like preventing like workers from making that choice that would like threaten not only their lives but other people's lives too, we think that is the best thing for the government to do. Furthermore, on this idea of polarization, we'd say that like this like anger, like people like getting upset actually led to like political change. Like a lot of people were upset because of the way like Trump handled the pandemic, and that led to them voting against him. We think that like that actually led to political action. We think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. We think that like people being upset about these things, like it led to like some things like January 6th, but it also led to like political action. We think people got really involved. Like there were more votes in like the 2020 presidential election than like ever, I don't want to say ever before, but like it was like a huge increase from 2016. So like that's a huge thing. I think actually like you can flip this or turn this point, judges, and say that actually this increased political participation because people were had things that they like had a stake in, they wanted to express their opinions. Then onto their onto their third contention about harms to the world, about how like there was a decrease in manufacturing of needed goods and that harmed the rest of the world. We'd say this is probably not the least of like those other countries' worries because they were also dealing with COVID. So we think this isn't just like really like a strong point that's like going to be important in the round, judges. And then on the idea of the signaling effect, and the idea of like combine like working to like it's like scientists like dealing with climate change was mentioned. I think like this idea is kind of like not like very important because of the fact that scientists were all preoccupied with like fighting COVID-19. Like they were all working on developing vaccines. Like all of their time was consumed by this one problem, so everything else was basically put on the back burner. So we think that like this would have happened in either world, because if COVID exists in either world, the scientists are going to be working to try to like solve that first before they get to the other things. So like they're saving a planet that like people are still on. So we think that this idea that like this like hindered like the development of like things stopping climate change is not necessarily true, because we think that like in both worlds, again, like the scientists are going to be focusing on and prioritizing COVID. We think that this contention just doesn't have like as much weight as the other two gov contentions. And furthermore, we think that we do like as the US federal government need to prioritize the US citizens. So we think that's what we need to be like measuring up against. Now to go into side op case, basically the response that we get on our first contention is that like the average person again is fine like when they get COVID. Again, like I already responded to this, like how severe COVID was in the beginning when like doctors didn't know how to treat it and when there wasn't a vaccine. So you can cross apply that. And then furthermore, on the idea about like the small minority, like they said like, oh, it's a small minority of people who could die. Like again, like we think like actually this like strengthens our point, because like if people are uniquely at risk, we need to value them even more because they need protection. So we need to care about these immunocompromised people, even if they're in the minority, like because they're at like so much more risk, we have to value their lives. Then we get this point in response to our second contention about how like a lot of essential work was like low income work. And we think like this is like, yeah, like some low income work was essential work, but there were also like low income jobs that like weren't essential work, right? Like like restaurant workers, like a bunch of things that like weren't. And we think like that's important. Like, yes, there were some low income people who were forced to go into work, but some people weren't. And that's the thing. Like you get a small win on side opposition, you don't get any of that on side government. So like, yeah, like we didn't like the economic shutdown didn't solve for everything, but it mitigated some of the impacts. And we think that is enough that you can vote for side opposition here, because you don't get any of that kind of solvency on side government. Furthermore, on their point about the response to the third contention, you can cross apply my refutation to their point about polarization. There's kind of like a back and forth there. And then finally, just on this idea again about like the service-based like work, again, like the important thing that I want to touch on here is that like once again, like not all like essential work, like not all like low-income employees like were essential workers. So the people that didn't go in, even if it was a minority of them, still didn't go in, they didn't risk getting the disease. That's something to vote on. I'll pause and then just everyone let me know when they're ready and I can one second to call. Is everyone good? Okay, amazing. Sorry about that. Okay. I will begin my time now. So there are a few things I want to go over in this speech, like just like some voter issues. So basically the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of like how much both sides help. So on side opposition, we basically tell you that like fewer people died, and you can't really like measure this because like so many people already died. So like the only thing I can ask you to do, Judge, is like imagine this like being like the COVID like loss of life in America being way worse. Like we don't really have like that idea of like what would have happened, but like we can like assume from like intuitively if more people are like going out and doing things, which we proved to you in my first speech, then more people are probably going to get sick, more people are probably going to die, and more people are going to infect people that are at risk. Now, on-site government, basically what they tell you is like, if we had like kept the economy open, then like people would have been like suffering like less, like in terms of like money, like people would have been like more healthy, like blah blah blah. And basically what you have here is a comparative. Like, is it better to like not be able to go to work at all, get some stimulus checks that probably aren't enough, or is it better to make the choice to go to work because you have no other options, get sick, then have to like go to a hospital that's like already like overrun with like patients that are sick, so you're not going to get great care, and then you're probably also not going to get compensated for those days, because once again, if you're working for like a big corporation, then like they probably don't have a great policy for like healthcare or for like giving you sick days, so you're probably not going to be getting any money in that world either. But on one side, you run the risk of infecting everyone else in your household, and you run the risk, like a higher risk of getting COVID, which is going to be super detrimental to like lower income or like anyone's like body and like health, like potentially fatal, even if not like huge health impacts, and like harms to like your brain, like harms to all of these things. We think that like on both sides, if you compare the two, like neither side is great, but on one side you have a higher risk of getting COVID and you don't really get like a lot more money on either side. So we think that like the side that like where you have less likelihood of getting sick is probably the better one. You're going to vote op here on how this impacts lower income people, because again, like there's a fallacy of choice that Gov is trying to push forth. Judges, do not buy this. When you are struggling with money, you are not going to like have a choice. You're going to have to do whatever it takes to get you that money. You're going to go into work, even if it means risking your health and your family's health. Now, the second voter issue that I want to talk about is the idea of like polarization and the idea of like trusting facts. And this is a big one, because I think like the big response, like the only response that I get to my third contention is like, oh, like cross apply like the stuff about like government botching communication. And I think like this is a really important point to talk about, because you still keep the warranting from my first speech, Judges, about how most people like end up listening to the scientists, because most people did like respect the shutdown, right? Like most people did not like go out of their way to like go outside. And that shows that people were willing to listen to the science. Even if they were upset with the government, they were willing to listen to the science. And the point of that contention, the impacts that I give you in my first speech, are that when you listen to science, you have a better informed democracy, and you have people that are like more educated and like more equipped to handle like these complicated issues because they have the facts, right? They have a basis of reality. And And that's the important thing for like the well-being of democracy and the well-being of individuals. That's something that you can cleanly vote side opposition on, because the only response or like kind of like counter like argument that you can like apply it to on-site government is this idea of polarization. But again, we tell you in my second speech that leads to like actual like more political action. So we think that's a net good, because people are making a statement about what they believe in response to the government's reaction. We think that's a net good. And then finally, the last kind of big voter issue that I want to talk about is like the economy in general, right? So one side is basically saying that like the economy would have been like so much better. So government is telling you the economy would have been so much better if we'd kept the economy open, but they don't really like explain what's going to happen when, again, like millions of people, like more people get sick and aren't able to work. Like what's going to happen to the US economy then? Like it's probably going to like collapse in that same way. And the POI that my opponent asks, it like basically proves to you the fact that like when you try to keep the government open, when you try to keep the economy open, and when it inevitably shuts down due to so many people getting sick, nothing's going to happen, and the US is only going to have to like solve for and mitigate the things that they actually tried to prevent in the first place by implementing the economic shutdown. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
All right, so I'm going to start my speech. Is everyone ready? Perfect. I'll start now. Hello, I'm still Kyler Parker. Opposition tries to paint you this world where the COVID shutdown went really well and our political system is in great shape and everyone's so happy and not poor and starving. But sadly, that's not the reality, because we've really got to think about what the status quo is and what the counterfactual we're offering you is. Here's some quick refutations about blog, right? Jenny ignores the huge middle class that does exist in this debate, instead deciding to focus on like the people who are like forced to go into their jobs. But the problem is this is such a narrow scope that she tries to turn into the like weighing mechanism of the entire debate that we're really ignoring how these people would be benefited by the middle class being allowed to work. Okay, so I'll explain to you why we win on scope and magnitude here. Okay, so opposition tries to feed you collective responsibility as kind of like their warrant here for their case, but I think the opposition has ignored our counterfactual that the government, if it was making the revenue that middle class people would have been generating for their jobs, like I mean middle class people without immunocompromised relatives who could go in and work and be filled, if the government was getting this revenue from like the increased economy, they could have enacted more precise policies to benefit those people who actually really needed it. Like what I'm saying is the majority of middle class people who did not have immunocompromised relatives could have gone into work, could have made that money, could have been happy, like crossplay like our entire contention about like a mental health of like the average worker who didn't want to stay home all day. Like they could have been happy, and then the government could have seen all the windfall from that and then actually help people who needed it. Instead, the government had to like kind of prop up everyone, even those who didn't need it that much. Just think of this counterfactual. Think of how people who are like super low income and would be like super desperate are the people who need the government's help the most. And the government could have actually focused on helping them if all of the middle class could like just keep supporting themselves on their income. Okay, like so Jenny literally said that the people who are going to choose to go in are super low income and super desperate. Therefore, these are the people who need the most money the most and suffer the most because they didn't have enough income. Like people who need to stay home for their at-risk relatives and still need income. Like the counterfactual obviously is that the government can have more money to subsidize these people, and then they can be comparatively better off. The government doesn't have to spread their money between everyone. They can just put all of their money in the people who actually need it. Like we help the poorest and we help the most at risk on our side of the house because we allow the majority to make the choice to go in instead of stopping the majority who would be fine like in work from going in and making the money we could use to help the poor. So like we win on this narrow scope, but also we win on like the wide scope too. Okay, so here's another refutation. Like basically Jenny said that like inflation is better than deflation. But basically she ignores the fact that the deflation did happen because of the shutdown. And this happened because governmental, like essential fear mongering prevented many people from coming into work even after the shutdown ended. Like this is a fact that after the shutdown ended, so many workers were afraid to come in that there was like so many job spots like opened up that no one wanted to fill, that there was severe deflation and things went very badly for the economy because of that. Like we prevent deflation on our side of the house. That is something we have. Okay. COVID in 2019, basically this COVID-19, like you got it for like a week for the majority of people and then you were fine. If you lost your job, you could lose it for months. Like crazy side effects are in the ultra minority and they could be predicted by underlying conditions with the government could help if they had more money, right? Op like paints this picture of it being like really, 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 really bad, but like really, it wasn't as bad as it was made out to be by the government. This is precisely why they should not have shut down the economy. Okay, here's another point. Polarization. Basically, Op tries to turn this by saying, well, actually, polarization is really good because people are expressing their political opinions. Unfortunately, polarization is not political participation. Polarization is a uniquely harmful effect of like growing hatred between political camps where people come to see each other as enemies and not parts of the same country. We think just because Op has conceded that like their side increased polarization, we just win clean here because like January 6th happened as an aftermath of this. Like there are riots, like the Proud Boys gained power, all of these white supremacist organizations gained power because people were willing to move farther to the alt-right because they saw the left establishment as like failing them by shutting down the economy. Like think of Ron DeSantis being like, Florida is fine. We opened up, we were still successful. Like think of all the political capital that the right gained. They were used to wage a bitter war against the left. Okay, shut down increased political participation. I just told you increased polarization. And the fact that people were willing to politically participate is just another sign they were desperate because the economy had ruined their livelihoods and they needed any change possible. They were just willing to vote for it. Okay. As the science being focused on scientists, and it's like this third contention of scientists, we tell you that like actually it was uniquely bad that the scientists were like actually working on the cures and not advising governmental policy because it seemed like the scientists were behind the governmental policy, whereas when Jenny tells you that they actually weren't, they were making the vaccines, they weren't writing the government policy. Therefore, people blame the scientists wrongly for the government's mess ups, and therefore, since the decrease in science has like increased, less people trust scientists. We think this is a complete turn to our side. Trust in science has gone down. This will lead to so many more deaths in the future because people won't take the medicine that they really should. And as to this point of the signaling effect, I think this is one of the cleanest wins we have here because, yes, of course, other countries decide to follow the US leads. It's seen as a world leader. So they followed the US and then they suffered all of the consequences that we outlined in our case. Okay, so just quickly with my last 30 seconds, what are the voting issues in this situation? The welfare of the majority of Americans. Our contention too about how American workers suffered from anxiety, from mental health, from bad finances, and from polarization and loss of trust has gone so largely untouched. You have to buy that the majority of Americans suffered like all of these negative effects, and like in terms of like magnitude, they could have gotten sick for a week, but instead, no, they have like polarization, they have lost their jobs, they have just had lives that are so much worse. That's like our first issue. Second voting issue, I think, is like polarization because polarization gets so much worse. Third voting issue is negative impacts on the rest of the globe, which has gone so ignored. I am so proud to urge this opposition ballot. Thank you.
Great round, guys.
The government world. I get that people who are still okay. The people who are still going into work are going to die, but I get that like a smaller proportion of people like it's not that like everybody's going back to work. I get that up and start from Gov on the counterfactual that the government can provide some forms of like checks that that like the most vulnerable people are still protected on the government side, which effectively removes a lot of the opposition's like offense on like the vulnerable people having to go to work and affecting their family members. Due to like in the counterfactual, the government isn't just going to sit there and do nothing. It's still going to provide some compensation that allows the most vulnerable people to stay at home. I guess like um like I still don't get how to weigh like people dying versus like the economy, and I think that like okay, I'll just go down well, like the second concern is like the long-term impacts of the pandemic. If you let it go unchecked, would it then lead to like would it then be a prerequisite to like government's impacts of like the economy doing bad or like more people dying? And I buy that um like yes, the pandemic was really hard to deal with in the beginning. Um, but I do think that like I do buy that like as the science like improved or like it would have gone down to like Gov's classification of the round where it's just like, oh, you're sick for a week and like very low chance of dying, which I think is like like well like I don't think that it's going to be that much of a long-term impact to outweigh the impacts that I get. Like I just get on up like um okay, sorry, I'm just okay. On up deaths, long-term impacts. I don't really buy the what's the importance of listening to scientist points. I think this is definitely something that goes to government with the polarization and distrust from the right, and like the political this gives to the right is like a significant negative impact. I get signaling effects. Like I just get like more diversified impacts on government that make it easier to vote for them. The signaling effects impact, I don't think truthfully it was that powerful. Like I feel like other countries would like make the choice on their own, like and like I still don't get reasons as to why other countries doing shutdowns. It's like maybe it was a good thing they did shutdowns, maybe it was a bad thing. Like I don't think it was expanded on enough to vote on it. The polarization stuff I thought was really like a long-term impact, and like the long-term distrust of scientists were also really like strong long-term impacts. And like anxiety affected all Americans, while like the immunocompromised was like I don't think that like the immunocompromised and like people who to go to work, I don't think that they're a super small minority, but I still think that like Gov's impacts like somewhat outweigh. Um and last impact is like obviously the economic stuffs, like um just like if you're sick, it's still temporary compared to like long term. Um yeah, that's overall I vote Gov.
I can go next. So I agree with a lot of what Julian said. I think it was a really difficult round to I think it was a really difficult round to evaluate in general because there were a lot of good arguments on both sides. I think in the end, a lot of things wash out, kind of because of what Jenny says in her speech, right? So I buy that, like, I think that backlash and polarization probably ends up washing out because it's pretty bad on both sides. I buy that this is generally a bad situation. So and that there's not like increments of badness at which people become like marginally more polarized. I buy that you're probably going to get significant polarization on both sides. Same thing for mental health, really. Like I think mental health in a global pandemic is pretty bad, no matter what way you slice it. I don't really buy the offense that Gov tries to get here, where they're like it's bad for people to be laid off work because you lose your social life. If Gov is also arguing that people are scared of the pandemic and that there's going to be also like health and safety measures that as they say at the top of case, I think it's difficult to buy that you get a significant increase in mental health. Where I end up voting is on this point of like agency on Gov versus like lives lost on op. Because I think Gov has this really compelling point where they're like, oh, it's important to restore the power of choice to Americans. People are able to weigh the risks by themselves. And then I think the response that we get from op here is that most people aren't actually going to be able to make this choice because they're forced to go into work. But I think that Gov has some good mitigation here where they're like, well, the people who are forced to go into work are probably going to be essential workers. And like a restaurant, in the case that it's a global pandemic, probably isn't going to be like, oh, we need to stay open. So we're going to force our employees to come into work. So I don't buy that there's a significant group of like lower income people who absolutely need to go into work because like their employers are making them do that in op world, sorry, in Gov world that don't need to be there in op world. I think that then what it comes down to is this weighing that we get in PMR on a lot of middle class people without immunocompromised relatives. I'm willing to buy that that's probably like the largest number of people. I don't think most people have an immunocompromised relative, even if it's not like as small of a minority as Gov tries to position it as. And I don't think that most people are living in extreme poverty. Most people are probably somewhere around middle class. So I think that in the end, because I think that agency is important for these people, for them to be able to make the decision about whether or not to go into work, because I think that the like lower income people clash kind of gets mitigated. I end up voting for Gov on that.
I share some of the rationale from both Julian and Zoe. I think what my initial conundrum, because it was close, was evaluating what would have happened, right? Like how many people would have been impacted ultimately. So in ops world, you know, if everyone had gone to work, everyone would have been, a big group would have been seriously impacted. Whereas in Gov's world, if everyone had gone to work, many fewer people would have been impacted, or the impact would have been substantially less. I think it was hard to decide which way to go. I don't think either one of you made such compelling arguments as to why your rationale was the best. So I kind of had to look at that one as a bit of a draw, to be honest with you, because we really didn't know for sure. I think Gov, your case might have been strengthened if you had brought up the fact that like in other countries, I know I had a friend who had children in Great Britain and they all went to school and there was no health impact, like they were fine. So if you had brought some of that, that would have strengthened your case there, but you didn't bring in that evidence. So I kind of gave that a draw. So then I looked at some of the other points that were raised. And again, we came up with the, I thought OP had the great, it was all about the lower income people. And I think OP had a really great point about government's responsibility to advocate for them and fight for them because they didn't have the power to do so themselves. However, I think government, as was said before, did do a good job in mitigating that because these workers ended up working regardless of any kind of shutdown. So, and then when I looked further at some of the other issues, I sided with Gov on the polarization. I felt like that was actually worsened. And the political, all the political different sides, as well as even distrust of science, I thought was worsened with the shutdown. And then the econ, I also sided with Gov because they did sort of say deflation happened, even with the shutdown. I thought that was a good point. And also there was the unrefuted point about, at least I didn't see it refuted, of consolidation and that not necessarily in the economy with big businesses. And I didn't see that successfully refuted. So those are the reasons ultimately, and then the rest of the world, I don't think that was kind of a wash. So those are the reasons ultimately why I sided with Gov. But again, I thought you all made some really great points. This was an excellent debate. And as with always with these decisions, I think even though it was a 3-0 decision, it actually was much closer than that scoreboard showed. So good job, everybody.